Saludos. So, as many of you know, we are in the middle of Hispanic Heritage Month, and being Mexican, having that culture, that heritage, it is a giant part of who I am as an individual, and I know many share that sentiment. So, as a way to reflect and celebrate, I wanted to have a discussion with someone who I thought would have wonderful insight on the subject, ACC's own Dr. Cdebaca-Cruz, who is the program coordinator for Mexican American and Chicago Studies. So, I really hope that everyone enjoys this discussion as much as I did.
All right, sweet. So I thought I would give you an icebreaker question, just kind of an easy one to start. What is your favorite Latin American dessert? I was going to say Mexico, like Mexican dessert, because I will die on this hill. I think Mexico makes the best desserts, but right. But I know Latin America has like such a variety of sweets and like desserts. So
true. The desserts. It's a tough one. I guess I would probably go with tres leches cake. I love tres leches. But I also love like a good like nieve, like de limon or mangonada.
Yes. Oh my goodness. See, I really love my mom's arroz dulce. She has this like certain way of making it that I just love. So anytime she's like, hey, I'm making this, do you want to come over? I'm like, yes, I do. But with all that, all right, on to our next question. I was going to go ahead and ask, what does Latinx Hispanic Heritage Month mean to you specifically?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think that it's like any kind of month. It's a time for us to celebrate what we celebrate every day of the year, right? Which is the excellence and beauty and value of our cultures and communities. And, we strive often to create spaces to share that more widely, but also to create spaces to share the excellence and beauty and value of our cultures in really critical ways as well. So part of what it means to me is a continuation of, or just kind of like a little bit more of maybe the work of every day, that I conduct in my teaching, in community organizing and community activism. But what I think that it means in part is that people who might be from outside Latinx cultures and communities are a little bit more open and receptive to it. So one of the things that I like about expanding this work and kind of having a bigger audience is like, for instance, with the Latinx heritage events that we're doing through the Mexican American Studies program and El Centro at ACC, is people are coming to these events who wouldn't necessarily come if it was like in, some other, in the middle of the summer or something like that. And one comment that we've gotten consistently is, I had no idea, and so people are wanting to learn more. So it's like, a jumping off point for a lot of people. And so it's my hope that for people who haven't had the experience of, all the beauty and excellence and value of our cultures, that, that they do take the opportunity to go out and to learn more and to make it more, a part of, learn how to build coalitions across communities, learn how to, learn different people that you can invite to a seat at the table. And, once you realize that like Latinos, that Latinx haven't always had a seat at the table, that's the invitation for you, right? To make that seat, to make that available and to give voice and bring in that value of the community. So, that's my hope is that Latinx and Hispanic Heritage Month can build those bridges. And at the same time, I also know that it takes a lot of work beyond just 30 days to sustain those coalitions and sustain those bridges.
Absolutely. I think I definitely agree with like kind of expanding this kind of like community that we have, because so, you know, when you think of like, you know, Hispanic excellence, you think of like Selena, you think of certain like authors, and that's just kind of like the tip of the iceberg. There's just so much to our culture that like people don't really realize. And even I don't realize a lot of it because, you know, second generation immigrant doesn't really like get a lot of exposure. So this way, in those 30 days, I can learn something new as well, just not just for people outside our community, which is great. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful way to learn.
Definitely. And just like, you know, with our kickoff event, we had a talk by Dr. Paul Ortiz, who talked about the history of organizing and coalition building, he called it intersectionality between Black and Latinx communities. You know, it's a centuries old history that a lot of us don't realize, but it's so powerful, you know, that solidarity across various lines of identity. And so, you know, really understanding like, you know, what about Latinx business communities? What about Latinx LGBTQ communities, Afro-Latinx communities? You know, like there's so much, you're absolutely right. Like there's so much that, you know, when we talk about, there's no single Latino experience, right? And so it's an opportunity for all of us to kind of open out, understand like the beautiful diversity and heterogeneity, you know, that characterizes us.
Absolutely. And speaking of the community, I was going to go ahead and ask as well, how do you think like the community, whether, you know, locally or just the entirety at large, how have that changed in the last few years? Is it something that you kind of predicted, or it kind of evolved in an unexpected way?
In the last few years, what do you mean in the last few years?
Do you like notice any kind of changes specifically, like either kind of negatively or positively, that you've kind of seen in the community at large?
I don't know that I've noticed changes necessarily. You know, one of the things to remember about really any like social identity, right, is that no group is a monolith. And I know there's been a lot of attention lately around the number of like politically conservative Latinos and things like that. And I mean, part of that is just because of sheer numbers, right? Like more attention has to be paid in politics to who Latinos actually are. So part of it is like a kind of misunderstanding of who Latinos actually are, that is just now kind of being, you know, having attention paid to it. But there's, you know, we're not a monolith. There's always been people who are politically, you know, kind of left wing, the politically right wing. We come from so many different experiences of migration, of exile, of dislocation or deterritorialization. All of our histories are so different that it's kind of hard to define also. That's, you know, that's the other thing. And so, you know, I talk to a lot of students who say, you know, like, as I guess one thing that has changed perhaps is there has been a slight increase in representation, like in the media, right? Or like celebrities and stuff like that. So a slight increase in representation. But with that comes this recognition that, you know, like as a Latina, if I don't look like Salma Hayek or Selena, you know, like that doesn't make me any less Latina, you know, that doesn't make me any less Chicana. And so one of the challenges of lacking representation is that the community does get viewed through this lens of like a single person or a single type, and does get stereotyped. And, you know, think about the number of nations that we represent of migration and things like that, you know, kind of come out of that. All of that variety, as well as like all the different politics that come out of those different experiences and histories of migration, right? All of that, you know, characterizes us each differently. There's a writer, or she's actually a former professor from UT. She's a poet and a performance theorist, Deborah Paredes, who she wrote a book called Selenidad. It's about Selena and kind of the manipulation of what she calls Latinidad or Latinx identity in the 1990s, and kind of how it cohered around like these grieving practices around Selena. And she talks about a particular structure of feeling, this like critical consciousness, but also this emotional kind of response that characterizes Latinidad. And when I talk about that with students, you know, some kind of can agree with it, but some also kind of are skeptical of it, right? Like we all don't have this same shared experience, you know? So I think that maybe if anything has changed, it has been a wider recognition of our own intersectionality, you know, that we have all of these intersecting identities that come from our histories, our experiences of gender and sexuality, our experiences of race, our experiences of privilege, or lack thereof, right? And that all of those kind of color us, you know, in different ways. So I don't know that the community has seen like a marked change in recent years, as much as maybe like the attention to the community is bringing more of a recognition of that, you know, we're not this like monolithic identity.
For sure. Definitely. Like, I definitely agree, because that is the truth. Like, I was born after Selena had died. And so, you know, I still grew up with her. I like religiously watched that movie with Jennifer Lopez. And my sisters afterwards never really like got the Selena thing, but that doesn't make them any less, you know, Latinx or Hispanic in a sense either, because, you know, it's that different kind of experience. It's different kind of like, you know, I'm different from the other Hispanic Latinx person next to me. Like we'll have maybe similar experiences, but not entirely the same. And I think it is really important to note that it's like, we all have different experiences with our cultures, with ourselves. So absolutely. Thank you for that wonderful response. But with that too, like Latin America has such a rich history too. Like every country has different histories, different kinds of things that have happened within them. And I mean, there's a lot. So I don't know if it's a really good question to ask about, like, can you think of any movements that like you would recommend looking into that are like either specifically interesting or maybe to get kind of like a idea of like culture in that Latin American country?
That's a good question. One of the things that I would say definitely is, and this is probably because like Dr. Ortiz's talk is like front of my mind, and I'm doing a reading group around his book where he talks about this, but a lot of the independence movements of like the late 18th century and then into the 19th century, looking at the international support among Black leaders, especially in the United States, but also, of course, in Haiti, and the connections that they drew from some of those independence movements in South America, looking at like Simón Bolívar, for instance, looking at the role that Che Guevara played in Cuba, right? But like looking at Latin American independence movements in general is, I find, fascinating. And I'm really, really interested in the way in which the Black American community kind of latched onto those and remained so connected, like the networks of communication that were usually at like various port cities, the networks of communication that they maintained, the multiple languages that were navigated to keep those networks of communication like all like present and current. I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it's something that we don't talk about enough in this country. We often think about that time period as well, like, U.S. exceptionalism and this understanding of freedom, but like Black Americans were looking at what Latin American independence movements were doing, and of course what Haiti was doing, and recasting freedom in a way that completely excluded slavery, right? When the founding fathers of the United States like weren't willing to make that jump. And aside from that, I'm always fascinated by the Mexican Revolution. And there's always new work coming out about that. With that said, when we talk about similarities, another aspect of history that doesn't necessarily get talked about a lot is that many countries from which we see mass migration movements into the US were also heavily influenced by political interventions from the US into those countries. So interventions of the CIA, installations of dictators who were friendly to US investments. And so for folks who aren't familiar with that history, or with those histories, and would like to know a little bit more about, why do we have so many migrants coming to us from El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, not to mention Mexico? Like, what is the history of Cuba and Puerto Rico? How did we get these large Latino communities, or like Nuyorican communities, or Miami Cuban communities, or the whole Southwest of the US? If you're interested in finding out how we got to where we are today in terms of immigration from Latin America, I would definitely recommend looking more into the histories of those countries and how the part that the US has played in the state of politics today in those countries. There's, as kind of like an entree into that, there's a great documentary. It's about 10 years old now already, called Harvest of Empire. And it's based on a book of the same name by Juan Gonzalez of Democracy Now!, that lays out a lot of these histories, and really shows, what the result of those interventions have been. And so, if you want to kind of take a more nuanced view of the immigration system in the United States and, find out a little bit, not only about what it's resulting from, but about how the US has invested its money in certain ways. And I think that can kind of also help us to get a better understanding of how we might take a different path forward. There's so much about immigration, but in terms of it, one of the tragic, ironic um, tragically ironic situations that is kind of shared across Latin American history. For better or worse, U.S. intervention is definitely one.
Yes, I didn't know about much about like foreign policy until I, got into the college classes that I was in, and understanding and realizing how much US intervention has like kind of had this giant sweep of migrants coming from those countries. It's insane. Like the degree, and just getting from the tip of the iceberg, just the degree how much you see is insane. And I definitely recommend independent study for sure. Like, I feel like a lot of people will learn a lot and understand that kind of nuanced take of migration. I think, especially here, we're right next door to Mexico. I think a lot of people have almost like a black and white view. And it's good to understand both sides, I think.
Absolutely. Well, and also the point that, nobody wants to leave their homeland, nobody wants to leave their home and their culture. It's out of necessity, that it happens. And even when we look now at the refugees at the border and that are in the immigrant prisons, it's a lack of recognition. It kind of seems like the sense that people just want to come to the US without that flip side of understanding that, would you leave your home if you didn't absolutely have to go seek asylum somewhere else? So
I think so.
We forget that a lot, but nobody wants to leave their culture behind.
For sure. I think that is the truth. Like, for you to uproot your family from the place that you lived your entire life to go to a country that you deem safer than where you currently are, I think that's like the greatest type of love that transcends borders and language. And yeah, I think too many people kind of forget that. But thank you for sure. And I know our time is kind of like running out. Do you have any like last parting words, any messages or anything like that?
Last parting words. I feel like we're ending on such a serious note with immigration. But it's definitely super important. I would just say, not just during Latinx Heritage Month, but every day, continue to support your Black and Brown businesses, continue to support your LGBTQ businesses and artisans and creators and musicians. We just had a great panel with some Latinx musicians. And then I just, on a, I guess, shameless self-promotion side of it, we're having a kind of film screening, but like on your own this week, of a film that's available for ACC students, faculty, and staff on Canopy, or anybody that has an Austin Public Library card can watch it. It's called Who is Diane Crystal? And you can watch it. And then there's going to be a talk with one of the directors, or with the director, Mark Sober, on this Friday. And then next week, we're going to be capping off our Latinx Heritage Month celebration with a panel of local entrepreneurs who are deeply connected to community and invested in leveraging our community excellence. It's called Latin Excellence, leveraging our community's excellence in the service of creativity, entrepreneurship, mental health and wellness. So that'll be on October 14th. So definitely look out for that too.
Awesome. I will definitely try to see if I can go. That sounds like so much fun.
Definitely. Yeah, I'll share the information with you.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much again. I am just super thankful that we had this talk.
I am too. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course.